And joining us now is a special advisor and assistant secretary general for climate action at the United Nations, Selwin Hart. Thank you so much for your time tonight. The UN Secretary General was clear. The UN climate report out today is a, quote, code red for humanity. The report did still say that there is time to avoid a worst case scenario, but we are locked into 30 years of worsening climate impacts no matter what. So what does success look like at this point?
Well, thank you so much for having me this evening. And it's definitely a code red for humanity. It evidenced mutable greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning and deforestation, choking our planet and placing the lives of billions of people at risk. Now is not the time for delay. Now is not the time for excuses. This is why this year's Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland this year represents a critical milestone for global efforts to address and defeat climate change. We need all leaders, all countries to step up to the plate. As I said before, now is not the time for excuses or for delayed action. We need to see bold actions from all governments, rich countries, poor countries, big countries, and small countries to reduce emissions drastically. As the science says that we must have global emissions over the course of the next decade. It is possible. We have the technologies, we have the resources to do it. At the same time, we're seeing these unprecedented impacts in the United States, but also in small and poor developing countries. Countries don't have the means and the capacity to respond to the massive impacts of climate change. In addition to reducing emissions, governments and the international community must invest in resilience building to support vulnerable peoples and vulnerable communities.
So if there's one bar for success, if we could be really specific, something that we can measure 10 years from now and say, okay, that worked, what would that one thing be?
Decarbonizing the energy sector. It's absolutely essential that we decarbonize the energy sector as quickly as possible. And we have the technologies available. We simply need to triple electricity generation from renewable sources over the course of the next decade or so. And it has been done before. Between 2010 and 2020, power generation from renewable energy sources, wind and solar in particular, tripled. We need to do this again, but at a much grander scale. And we must consign fuels like coal to dustbin. We cannot, the single greatest step that must be taken to keep this 1.5 degree goal within reach is to phase out coal. And this must be a key objective of the Glasgow conference.
What's the worst case scenario if the world does not heed the warnings laid out in this report?
Well, it will be a planet that is unlivable. As the report clearly indicates, lives of billions of people are at stake. We cannot survive in a 4-degree world or a 3-degree world. Warming has increased by about 1.2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And we're seeing these unprecedented impacts in all countries, every continent. A worst case scenario will be billions of lives. We really can't think of a worst case scenario. I think all global efforts now need to be focused on how do we our children.
You know, I guess my question would really be to follow up there is, do you think that global action is not just feasible, but realistic? Is it your expectation that these world leaders are going to take the necessary action?
Yes. We're cautiously optimistic. And over the course of the last few months or so, we've seen many governments committing to net zero by mid-century. About 73% of total global greenhouse gas emissions are now covered by a net zero commitment. We've seen the entire G7 group of nations commit to net zero by 2050. We've also seen many other large economies also making this commitment. But we need all of the G20 nations. These nations account for about 80% of global emissions. We need all of these countries to commit to net zero as a first step, but also back up this long-term commitment with ambitious interim targets. And again, at the recent G7 summit in the United Kingdom, we saw all of the G7 countries step up with more ambitious, what are called national climate plans or nationally determined contributions. But we need all countries to be more ambitious, to use this next decade. What happens, we will win or lose this race over the course of the next decade if we don't reduce emissions, if we don't have emissions by the end of this decade. We will have no hope of beating the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement.
It seems so soon. And lastly, I know that you were just saying that you need all of the G20 countries to participate, but let's point out in particular the United States. It feels like we would need to play an extremely large role in all of that. What's your message to President Biden and our own country's leaders?
Well, President Biden has taken some extraordinary steps over the course of the last few months. He has increased the U.S.'s commitment to climate action. He's convened global leaders, and we need President Biden to continue to display that global leadership, amazing global leadership. We also need all large countries, all of the G20 countries, to follow this type of example. And we also need wealthy countries to not forget that they need to support resilience building and adaptation in the smaller and poorer countries. This must be a global effort. It must be a moment for global solidarity. Many of the impacts that you're seeing in the United States, in Greece, and other parts of Europe are being seen in small island nations. They're being seen in Africa. Warming in Africa is occurring at much greater levels than the global average. So in addition to reducing emissions domestically, countries like the United States must also reach out and support the smaller and poor nations who are already battling with many of these devastating impacts from climate change. And that's what the Glasgow conference is about. It's about looking at this issue from through a comprehensive lens. We must reduce global emissions, but we must also protect vulnerable people and vulnerable communities in every corner of the earth.
Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action at the United Nations, Selwin Hart, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you so much, Linsey. Always a pleasure.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.